Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today for our Preservation Book Club author talk all about spiritualism's place with two of the authors, Averill Earls and Elizabeth Garner Masarik. My name is Katie Peace. I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. If you have found your way to this webinar but are not familiar with the League, we empower all New Yorkers to use historic preservation to enrich their communities, protect their heritage, and build a sustainable future. The Preservation League does this work in every corner of New York State in many different ways. We provide grants that jumpstart preservation projects. We advocate for preservation at the local, state, and federal level. We provide technical assistance, collaborate with local colleagues across the state. We award excellence in historic preservation and draw attention to at-risk historic sites. And we also offer a host of virtual programs like the one you're tuning in for today. And I do want to thank our sponsors, the Peggy Ann and Roger G. Gary Charitable Trust, as well as all of our members who make this kind of work possible. It's an intimate history of Lilydale, New York Center for Spiritualism that was founded in 1879. The book reveals the role that this fascinating place has played within the history of spiritualism, as well as within the development of the women's suffrage and temperance movements and the world of New Age religion. As an intentional community devoted to spiritualist beliefs and practices, Lilydale brings together multiple strands in the social and religious history of New York and the United States over the past 150 years. Feminism, social reform, utopianism, new religious movements, and cultural appropriation. Authors Averill Earls, Sarah Hanley Cousins, Elizabeth Garner Masarik, and Marissa C. Rhodes each identify one site in Lilydale and one theme that its history illuminates. They use those sites and themes to approach Lilydale not as debunkers, but as inquisitive researchers and storytellers. Spiritualism's place breaks myths, unveils unexpected stories, and finds new ways to contemplate spiritualism's role in American history. And if you haven't read it yet, I do encourage you to do so. It's really very fascinating, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. But to further convince you, we're very excited to welcome two of the book's authors today. Averill Earls and Elizabeth Masarik will be talking a little bit about how they wrote the book, the research they did, all of that good stuff. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the two of them to tell you more about spiritualism's place, Lilydale, its history, and how they got into this kind of work. So take it away.
Thanks so much, Katie, for that introduction. And we'll jump right in with a little introduction to us and the book. So, as Katie mentioned, I'm Averill Earls, and this is Elizabeth Garner Masarik, and we are two of the authors of this book. Our other co-authors are Sarah Hanley Cousins and Marissa Rhodes, who couldn't be here today. We're all professional historians, academic historians, and also the co-hosts and co-founders of Dig, a History podcast. And that's an important detail, not just because we want you to listen to our podcast, but because it was through the podcast that we were approached by Cornell University Press to pitch an idea for a book, trying to leverage sort of our existing audience of podcast listeners and sort of our personalities as podcast hosts into a co-authored book. And so that is sort of where we started the project and where we then launched into pitching this project for a book about Lilydale, New York. So Lilydale, New York is in Western New York, about 50 miles south of Buffalo, which at the time when we pitched a project to Cornell University Press's local New York history imprint, Three Hills Press, it was where we were all based. We were all living in Buffalo at the time. We all went to University at Buffalo for grad school together, and we launched the podcast when we were grad students, and then have been doing it together ever since. So now it's 8 years. This is our 8th year doing Dig, which is wild and also exciting. And so Lilydale is an intentional spiritualist community in this sort of rural wooded area of Western New York. It's really quite tucked away in the woods. It's on a little lake in Cassadaga Lake system or lakes, and it was built as and remains a small intentional community for spiritualists. And here's a picture from the late 1890s, early 1900s of Lilydale in its heyday. You can see sort of the gates, which are really an important moment or space in terms of you enter through the gates. And today you'll pay a gate fee, and back then you did as well, because regular people, not just spiritualists, were invited into this community every summer during what is called camp season, which is a sort of religious revival offshoot in which communities of religious people would get together to pray, but also to sort of recreate, to picnic, to dance, to sing, to commune with each other and with, in this case, spirit and God. So every summer, Lilydale would open their gates from their founding in 1879, and still till today, so you can visit them today, to visitors from all over. Sometimes as many as 10,000 or more visitors came during camp season to speak with their dead, to attend seances, to participate in workshops, and to hear from a variety of prominent speakers, which is the appeal still today, I think, of Lilydale, and was certainly the appeal in the late 19th and early 20th century, when these kinds of resort spaces, which all had some sort of like particular bent, whether we're talking about the Borscht Belt for the mid 20th century for Jewish communities, or these sort of intentional spiritualist communities all across sort of Northeast and into the Midwest of the United States. And Elizabeth's going to tell you a little bit about the history of spiritualism and in sort of Lilydale's place within that.
Right. So, as Averill mentioned, Lilydale is founded as a spiritualist camp. Spiritualism comes out of the Second Great Awakening, which is a religious revival movement that's going on throughout the United States and Western Europe. And it's going on roughly the 1820s to the 1850s. But in Western New York, where Lilydale is eventually founded, the Great Awakening is really kind of on fire. In fact, the area along the Erie Canal in Western New York becomes known as the burned over district because it is burned over with the fires of revival. So here we can see one of these kind of what they would call camp meetings that were kind of quintessential of the Second Great Awakening. Basically, a kind of itinerant preacher or a very kind of charismatic preacher would, stop in one of these kind of small towns along the Erie Canal and hold camp for a week, 2 weeks. And essentially people would come out, as you see here. They would, pitch a tent, or just come out if it was on, easily accessible, perhaps, just come out for the day, and they would listen to preachers. They would kind of feel this new revival, this new evangelical Protestant Christianity that was being preached at the time, and they'd come out and they kind of make a day or a weekend or a week of it, see friends, perhaps be born again, so to speak, and then they would go home, and go about their day. But this was really, it was part entertainment, it was part religious revival. And again, these kind of meetings are really cropping up all over Western New York in this burnt over district. The district also becomes very known for alternative religions. So out of this area in Palmyra, New York, you have the Mormons that began with when Joseph Smith allegedly digs up the golden tablets, so to speak. And of course, another Protestant adjacent religion that comes out of this area is spiritualism. So you can change the slide for me, Ave. So this is a picture of the Fox sisters. They are living in a small cottage in Hydesville, New York, which is not very far from Rochester. Rochester really is one of the centers of the Second Great Awakening. And in 1848, the sisters began to experiment with talking to the spirit of a dead peddler that had been buried within the cottage walls. What began perhaps as, children playing, talking to spirit, hey, are you there? Hearing a rapping, rap, rap, rap. Yes, I'm here. They kind of start speaking back and forth with spirit. But what happens is essentially the adults in the room, so to speak, began to take it seriously. Their mother is, of course, freaked out. But news begins to kind of travel throughout the neighborhood that there's something kind of interesting going on in the Fox Cottage. Long story short, Amy and Isaac Post, who are very well-known, well-respected abolitionists, reformers, part and parcel of kind of the interconnectedness of the community in and around Rochester and the outskirts. Essentially hear the Fox sisters speaking with the spirit and deem that it is legit. And that kind of opens the door to bringing the Fox sisters to Rochester, New York. They end up showcasing their ability to talk to spirit in Corinthian Hall. Corinthian Hall, is famous for many events. The second Women's Rights Convention, Frederick Douglass, his What to the Slave of 4th of July is delivered in Corinthian Hall, right? So a very big kind of legitimate space, right? And so the Fox sisters come and they, showcase their abilities. And essentially this starts a phenomenon of spiritualism, of people attempting to speak with the dead, either through rappings, as the Fox sisters did, or kind of morphing into seances, or to people standing on a stage and channeling spirit, which perhaps we'll have a little bit of time to get into. But if you'll go to the next slide, Averill, I just want to sometimes this sounds a little silly to us, right? That these young teenage girls would be taken so seriously. But at this point in time, Second Great Awakening, 1820s to 1850s, it's also within a time period that historians call the Market Revolution. You have an explosion of commerce. You have the Transportation Revolution, which the Erie Canal is part of, right? That's one of the reasons that those itinerant preachers were able to spread the fires of religion through Western New York, because they now have the Erie Canal. Trains are coming into effect at this point in time. And the communication revolution, newspapers with steam presses, right? Newspapers are able to be printed and spread along those transportation lines much quicker than they were before. And of course, you also have the telegraph, which we have here, right? So the rat-tat-tat of Morse code sounds very much like what the Fox sisters were doing. Rat-tat-tat, are you there? Yes, no, right? And so I bring this up to show that the idea that talking to spirit was actually quite phenomenal and quite aligned with the science of the day. If you think about, if you're bouncing along in 1815 and you live in Buffalo, New York, and you have a cousin that's in Virginia and you want to get them a letter, it could take up to a month for that letter to get there, right? Horseback and, boat and whatnot, right? And that's even if that letter gets there. By 1845, you have telegraph wire up. And what used to take days, weeks, months of getting a message to your cousin in Virginia, now you can just go to the telegraph office, you give them words, they somehow change that into tapping, and then your cousin gets that message in a matter of minutes. That is magical, right? That seems otherworldly, right? So the fact that these scientific, revolutions essentially kind of change time and space, make things like speaking to spirit, speaking through the veil, speaking to other worlds, not seem that out of the ordinary, right? It look at all of these things that have changed, that have happened. Why can't we speak to the other side, right? So that's kind of what's going on, and that gives some credence as to why this spreads so rapidly. So the next slide, a feminist religion. Spiritualism is very much taken up by the women's rights movement. There is a book, Radical Spirits by Anne Browdy, that chronicles this very, very well. But essentially what's going on is now the individual has access, through spiritualism, has access to the divine, to spirit. They no longer need a male pastor or preacher to dictate for them, right? in the 19th century, women, the gender roles of women are seen as very passive, very emotional. This goes along with the idea of becoming a spirit medium, i.e., being open to spirit coming into you and speaking through you. So it becomes a very kind of women-centric, women-focused religion. And so many of the early women's rights advocates are also spiritualists. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Seneca Falls Convention happens, just essentially miles away from Hydesville in the same year, 1848, when the Fox sisters are hearing the first rappings. So you can change the slide. So up until now, I've really been talking about the Second Great Awakening, 1820 to 1850. So how does Lilydale come into this in 1879? But really, in order to understand Lilydale, which is in Western New York, it is still within that burnt over district, we have to understand kind of those revivals and the history that it comes out of. And so even though Lilydale was founded in 1879, technically after the Second Great Awakening, it is very much part and parcel of that spirit of scientific investigation, that spirit of new religions and excitement in religion. And it comes out of kind of those Methodist camp recreation movements that are also very popular in the 19th century, like the Chautauqua Institution, which is just 7 miles from Lilydale over the hill. When they would go back and forth between Chautauqua and Lilydale, they would often say, we're going over the hill. So we're going over the Chautauqua, right? But during the 19th century, so 1880 through 1895-ish, roughly, really the draw in this area was not the Chautauqua Institute, but it was Lilydale. And that is something that has kind of been lost to history. Lilydale really was the place to go if you were at all interested in reform movements. And many of the major suffrage organizers of the time period took a summer pilgrimage to Lilydale. So this picture here, it's taken in 1893. You have Marion Skidmore, who was kind of one of the grand dames of Lilydale. She's a very important piece of bringing speakers to Lilydale, bringing the women's suffrage movement into Lilydale. And you see her there in the middle holding a sign that has 2 stars on it. At that point in time, 1893, the only 2 states that allowed women to vote in the Union were Wyoming and Colorado. And so those are the 2 states that are listed on there. 1893 is a big year in New York State because the following year there is going to be a constitutional convention. And so all of the major suffrage organizations, particularly the New York State suffrage movement, is really descending on the state to try to pump up support of changing the New York State Amendment to allow women the vote. Now, spoiler alert, that does not happen actually until 1917. New York State's one of the last states to allow women the right to vote before the passage of the 19th Amendment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So this picture here in 1893, this is taken in Lilydale. You can see the tent behind them. Again, very much in kind of this tent revival idea, like from the Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening. Many people would camp in tents, although Lilydale, from its earliest inception, did start having permanent structures. And it was one of the few national camps that had really permanent structures. But so you have Marion Skidmore holding the sign there. To her left, our right, 2 over sitting down, that is Susan B. Anthony. They're sitting again, they're showing her support for women's suffrage. She sojourned to Lilydale every year, minus just a couple, up until her death. So she died in 1906. And Susan B. Anthony, Reverend Anna Howard Shaw, oh my gosh, I'm going to blank on some of these other people, but major Crystal Eastman, major suffragists of the era are visiting Lilydale on a regular basis, both being asked to come and speak, but also just coming because they find like-minded people there. They're not spiritualists themselves, but they come because It's a place of ideas. It's a place of camaraderie. It's a place of early feminism, right? And so it's a place that they can come, and it's an audience that is very willing to hear the message of women's rights and women's suffrage. So the next picture is again a picture of Anna Howard Shaw. She's there in the fabulous black hat, and that is her sitting with a bunch of ladies from Lilydale, and they're in front of the Maplewood Hotel, which is the main hotel in Lilydale, New York. And again, Anna Howard Shaw, even after Susan B. Anthony's death in 1906, she continues to visit Lilydale up until 1915, so just a few years before her death as well. And I will let Averill take over from there.
So, Spiritualism's Place, we came up with this title not because spiritualism was founded in Lilydale, obviously. It's founded, according to the historians of spiritualism and spiritualists themselves, in Hydesville, New York. But and even not because Lilydale was not the only of these spiritualist camps that existed in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. It is, however, one of the longest remaining, and I think one of the only remaining, other than Casadega in Florida, and maybe some other sort of holdouts, but still one of the most popular of these sort of camps that has existed now for, I don't do math because I'm a historian, but like 150 years almost, right? They're coming up on that milestone. And so this is a place where people go to experience something, to connect with their dead, to connect with their friends, to sort of it's sort of in many ways removed from time. So we picked this spot to focus, to pitch as a history for that we would write collaboratively for Three Hills Press, because of some of us, Marissa and Sarah, had been there several times. They have very personal stories that they share about those experiences in the book. And then, though Elizabeth and I had never been there, it's sort of place that we're interested in. And especially Elizabeth is more of the occultist in our quad, and I'm very much more on the other end of the hardcore skeptic. But I'm interested in people and what they believe and what their histories are. So that was sort of what drew us, I think, to this place. And I'm not even sure how or why we ended up we this came to us, but it sort of was serendipitous, because in many ways, it's a place that is for people like us, which is, it's not a damning critique, but it's certainly an important one to recognize, right? We're four middle-aged white women, socioeconomically at this point in our lives, middle to upper class, middle to upper middle class. And that tends to be the folks who are attracted there now and who were attracted there then, right? Like the women in these pictures that Elizabeth was showing you, who had the time and the means to dedicate themselves to women's suffrage and the early feminist movement, they were women like us and older, right? So Lilydale was founded late in the spiritualist movement, closer to the formal organization of the Spiritualist Church, the NASC. And that, I think, also is not a coincidence. Its location is ideal, and then it becomes a really popular summer destination. It's a spiritualist and religious camp, yes, like the Methodists and other utopian religious gatherings that Elizabeth described, but it's also leading the way in some of these summer resort towns, right? Thinking about the Poconos in Pennsylvania, or again, the Borscht Belt in upstate New York. It's very family friendly at its iteration, and for most of the early 20th century, until it didn't need to be anymore, right? Today you go there are not many children. But as you can see from this photograph from the early 20th century, there was a time period when it was very popular for families to come to Lilydale. They had the Lyceum, which was sort of like a summertime daycare slash school for kids to go while their parents were hanging out and going to seances and worshiping and partying. There's swimming, there's sports, there's activities. There's a lot of fun sort of structured events like dances and music, and they would have, like, on the same beach that we're seeing here, on the other side of that, they would have sort of bands playing on the beach, and then they at one point had like a barge that was a floating raft that people were out there dancing on, right? They brought in educational opportunities with speakers and workshops. And as Elizabeth described, this is a political place with speakers and theme days dedicated around things like women's suffrage for Women's Day. And obviously, of course, religious experiences, right? The seances, the private readings that you can now and could then book with a medium, the healing temple, the church services every week and every day, etc. So in its early decades, it carried lots of radical ideas and was led by radical people. By the 1920s, the governing board was dominated by men. And by the 1940s, the performativeness of the camp experience was under fire as other spiritualist camps closed and physical mediumship was sort of cut from the summer programming. And Christian spiritualism began to dominate the membership as opposed to sort of this more free-flowing spiritualism of its early iterations. So in some ways, Lilydale and the Spiritualist Church changed dramatically over the years. But in other ways, in sort of the belief in mediumship and the afterlife, the incorporation of various traditions into spiritualist practice, traditions like today, New Age religion and Native American spirituality, the emphasis on gathering each year to learn from each other, to sit in nature and to commune with the dead, and honestly, the whiteness of the community, all of these things today are the same as they were in 1879. And so for us, that made this a sort of a really interesting case study for the four of us to explore, to experience, to witness, to investigate. And since we're talking here with people who are enthusiastic about preservation, I wanted to talk about a little bit about our experience in the archive, right? The work that we did was archivally based, and the archive itself is the Lilydale Museum, which exists on the ground. So we had to go there. We spent, weekends and weekdays there together. We would in the evenings do the sort of Lilydale experience things, and then we'd spend our days hanging out with the archivist and historian of Lilydale, Ron Nagy, who gave us access to the archive, which is an interesting term, I think, for what they have, because they have like big plastic boxes that you buy from Home Depot with just piles of paper, and they have some filing cabinets with some folders in them. And there's no finding aid, there's no catalog. It's something that exists only in the current at that moment archivist head. And so there is a real danger of losing some of this history, right? Because they don't have the funds necessarily or the training to engage in sort of historic preservation of their archival material. They are really engaged in and invested in protecting the preservation of the buildings and the spaces of Lilydale, right? They're in some ways really reticent to do many major upgrades because that might harm the integrity of the historical and sort of closed off out of time-ness of the place. And they have to, follow historic preservation guidelines when doing any renovations to the homes at this point in Lilydale. But those archival materials in particular were really, in some ways concerning to us, but interesting to us as well. And so actually when we finally got access to not just the archival material, but to the Lilydale private board meeting minutes, which are held not in the archive, but in the sort of main administrative building, we worked with the folks there to recommend some archival practices for preserving those minute books, so that they got the right archival quality boxes to contain those in, move them out of the sort of dank, dusty, moldy, damp basement, and hopefully to then preserve those materials for future researchers as well. There's a lot of photos in the archives that are not dated or, again, cataloged in any sort of recognizable way. So it's a little bit of a challenge there to date a lot of the materials in the archives. And we got special permission, right? Like we had to request special permission from the Lilydale board to use all these images, and they are all in the book. But yeah, the dating on them is not as well preserved as it could be.
Yeah, and I think you see that in reading the book too, because some of the captions have like from this folder or this box, and it's like clearly like Okay, yes, it's a little disorganized, but I also loved in the book the mention that you had that like you were so grateful to Ron for his like graciousness and helping you that you like everything that you digitized you gave him on a thumb drive just like as a little token of your thanks, which I thought was very sweet, and kind of showed how into it you got as people, like because you're just people. You're historians, but you're people too. And he was, you know, it seemed like he became kind of a character in the book as well
Oh,
by the end of it.
you don't need to be a character in a book. He's a character in real life. Ron Nagy is a gift. So my favorite moment, I guess, was the very first day we met Ron Nagy. I had emailed him ahead of time, like several times, being like, "Hey, we're researchers, we're historians from the Buffalo area. Here are our credentials. We want to come down and take a look at the archives. We're hoping you'll let us see what you've got." And we showed up, and he had printed out my email. And was holding it up, and I'm standing there in like a liberal feminist witchcraft neck cutout t-shirt and shorts, and Marissa's standing there with me, and she's got her big like Stanley size water bottle cup, and he's like, "You're Averill Earls?" I thought it was gonna be the Men in Black coming down to take me out, and and I was like, "No, Ron, we're just a couple of gals coming on down, trying to take a look what you got." So he would razz us pretty good, and that's always a good start to a relationship with the four of us.
Yeah. And I just want to say too, because you mentioned Katie that he kind of becomes a character in the book. I mean, that was one of the things about this particular format that really freed us up, right? Like we've all written academic monographs, that have a very like stylized, we have to do this, this, and this, and prove this, this, and this. And this is an academic book, right? Like as you mentioned, like we have footnotes, we have proof, but we're able to insert ourselves a little more into this book than we normally would in a traditional book. And so bringing people like Ron in, and yeah, I mean, it was just such a special thing for us. Like April said, he thought, I don't know, we were gonna be the G-men or whatever coming to get him. And each time we went, like he would become a little more comfortable with us, and he'd show us a little more, and he'd show us a little more. So by the end there were these locked cabinets that he was opening it up and letting us see. So it was, I mean, I think that speaks to like the preservationists, like, also building a rapport with the people that you're working with, right? And not, you can't just always rest on your academic laurels, so to speak, right? Like you really have to develop relationships with people. And I don't think if it had gone that way, it would have been such a good book, because there were things that we didn't get maybe to the last time we visited, right? Because he was finally like, oh yeah, and of course bringing cookies and things like that helps, but we developed a relationship with the place, with the space, with the history, with the people. So it really was a collaborative effort. It was great.
Yeah.
Lovely. And I'm curious to know, like, how does this kind of fit with your academic historian hats, like the stuff that you typically study, and then kind of related, like, as you were getting into the archives and being in Lilydale, was there anything that really surprised you in visiting, or anything really interesting that you found out that didn't quite make it into the book?
I'll start because Elizabeth has a much more straightforward answer to this question, and mine is much more circuitous, but also gets a little bit at Miriam Khan's question um that's in the chat. So I'm a historian of Britain and Ireland and gender and sexuality, and so I thought that when we picked up this topic and this place to be our project for the podcast, that I'd be like, what am I doing here? I have nothing to contribute to this project. I'm a researcher, sure, but I have no contextual knowledge to like back this up. But then the deeper I got into it, the more I realized that, spiritualism is a transatlantic movement, religious movement. It is very popular in Britain, particularly, but also across the European continent. The sort of the chapter that I wrote other than the intro and the conclusion, the chapter that I wrote about the Victorian cottages ends up being about Victorian gender roles and feminism, and that was very much in line with what I have been doing and studying for my entire career as a historian. So it seemed when we started the project that I would have very little to contribute, but then by the end, I felt like, yes, this is just sort of a natural outgrowth, really, of what I've been doing as a historian for my career.
And I am a historian of US women's history, particularly of the 19th, early 20th century. So it was right up my alley. I'd say the way it changed my history is my first book is on the welfare state. And I really always had kind of conceptualized reform movements and the suffrage movement as two separate beings. And of course, doing that first book made me realize that was not the case. But then really getting into this reform work of reform, spiritualism, suffrage. And again, it just really kind of changed my perspective of and made the suffrage movement more interesting to me. And I've since kind of continued that history, and I'm working on a follow-up book of a few of the women that we found in the archives here at Lilydale that are suffragists, spiritualists, and reformers. And so hopefully soonish there will be another book kind of following up on some of those individual lives. So
happy.
One question from the Q&A. Did Arthur Conan Doyle ever visit Lilydale? And you do mention him several times throughout the book. So I'm curious about that as
yeah,
well.
there was no evidence that he did visit.
Yeah, and we looked through a lot of the hotel registers, and Ron Nagy, one of the things that he's done in his time as archivist is sort of flag the famous people in the registers with like little notes, just because those are going to be pieces of interest to people who visit Lilydale. And Arthur Conan Doyle was not one of them. Mae West is someone who did visit and funded, I think, some project or some building on.
Oh, the Forced Temple.
That's
Not
right.
Forced Temple, the Healing Temple.
Healing Temple. That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Um, Someone asked if there is a relationship to Chautauqua. You talk about this a little bit, but
Yeah, so the Chautauqua movement, so they are not excuse me, they as far as founding is concerned, there is no connection, but again, like-minded people, right? Like Chautauqua again comes out of that Methodist camp movement, so very similar to the spiritualist camp movement, different kind of religions. I mean, I think Baptists had their own kind of camps, right? Like these different kind of denominations, so to speak, were having these, camps in the 19th century where people could go and spend a week, 2 weeks, the whole summer, or whatever, hanging out with their friends, doing some praying, getting some learning on, that kind of thing. As far as them being connected, one of the first times that Susan B. Anthony comes to Lilydale, she does also visit Chautauqua because they're having some discussions there of suffragists and anti-suffragists. So again, it's very like common cause, and people who would visit Lilydale would go to Chautauqua and vice versa. But officially, no, they're not connected, but they're connected in the kind of ether of progressive reform ideology kind of thing.
yeah, and there are definitely these camps that were camps that are like little hamlets now. Like Round Lake is one of them. Like they kind of pop up all over New York, and they still exist in some capacity. A couple of questions, kind of variations on a theme about the status of Lilydale today,
Yeah.
what visitors can expect when they go there, if people own their houses. And I know Lilydale does things a little bit differently. So if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so Lilydale is when it was founded and continues to be a sort of private entity that they have a board and it manages the sort of the land. So Lilydale itself is not actually technically a town. It is in a hamlet, and then the area that we call Lilydale is the land owned by the Lilydale Association. or Lilydale Assembly. And so you can't just buy a house there. Like if a house goes up for sale, you can't just be like, oh yeah, I'll make an offer and I'll buy it. You have to there's like this weird property thing where you have to first to live there at all, you have to be approved by the Lilydale board. You have to be a member of the Lilydale assembly or a spiritualist church, depending on the year that we're talking about. And so if you own a house there, to sell it, you have to do that also through the board. And you cannot get a mortgage to buy a house there because of the weird like property status there. So you have to be able to have cash to live there. So there are permanent residents there. A lot of the folks at this point have converted their like there's like beautiful Victorian houses. They've converted a lot of them into Airbnb type things or temporary short stays. The one we stayed in, the woman who owned it lived in the basement and rented out this like beautiful. I think it had probably like 6 or 8 bedrooms with a kitchen and a living room and upstairs common room. And so I think that is a way that folks make passive income throughout the year um, with their homes. And then there are others that are just yeah, just for sort of private residences that mediums own that have also gone through this process, and they live there and do private readings out of like a front room or an office in their homes. So when you go to Lilydale, I mean it looks very similar to those pictures that I showed early on. Not much has changed. The gate is a little more elaborate now, and there's like a little gatehouse where someone will take your money when you go in because you pay a gate fee for the day to go and visit. It's still got the hotel inside the grounds. It's got all these little Victorian cottages. It's got a cafeteria and like a little cafe, as well as a coffee shop on the grounds. There's a big auditorium, which is where they do speakers mostly. We'll be there this coming July 10th, I think it is, talking about the book. There's the Forest Healing Temple or the Healing Temple and there's a library and the museum, and it's just like a little walkable town. Yeah, so you go and you walk around and you go to events, and every day, twice a day, they do free readings, like group readings at the stump in the woods, which we didn't talk about, but you can learn more about in the book. And if it's too hot or mosquito-y, because they're very concerned about their elderly visitors, those free readings might be in the auditorium instead. Um, and you just sort of spend the day, maybe make an appointment with a medium to get your whatever read, and or go to the free ones, go to the museum, get some coffee. The cafeteria is actually really delicious food. The
Yep.
Lily. Yeah. Yeah,
And I'll just say,
yeah.
I mean, to enhance your experience, if you haven't gone and you're going, I would recommend booking a reading if you wanted to get a reading with a medium, booking that in advance because they do fill up quite fast. Now, with the age of internet, most people book online. Back in the day, and some of them still do this. They would have a like a list, a sign up list that they would post on their front door, and like you'd go out early in the morning and you'd sign up for the people that you wanted to see. But now pretty much everybody's done their bookings in advance, so it's really hard to find one on the day of. So just want to give you a heads up.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you spend time there too, I would say, and talk to people like Ron Nagy and the folks who work in the cafeteria, they'll have opinions of who is the best medium, who's the realist medium to go visit. And so you can get recommendations that way, or you can just, throw the dice and sign. There are many. There are many. And they're all
Yeah.
listed on the Lilydale website as well. If they have to be sort of at this point, they have to be sanctioned to do
Mm-hmm.
readings on the Lilydale grounds. In the early days, there were all kinds of mediums and spiritual showmen who worked the grounds without sort of official licensure from the assembly. But now, again, since the 1940s and 50s, since they sort of tightened up control over those things, it's much more
Mm-hmm.
officialized, I guess. Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, and you talked about this in the book too, where like yeah, today they definitely like anybody who's doing it in the grounds has gotten prior approval from the assembly. But they also like got rid of physical mediumship at a certain point. They kind of like reined it in because you talk a lot about this in the book about fraud in the spiritualist community and people who are like really invested in this religion and believe in it with their whole heart. Like they don't want people thinking that spiritualists are, frauds out there. And that was definitely a big thing for a big part of the history. And then another thing that you talk a lot about in the book that we haven't gotten a chance to talk about yet is the connection to the temperance movement too. And Lilydale still today is a dry campus.
Yes.
And so, thinking about, as you said, Averill, you went into this thinking like you don't have anything to add to this. This is not your area of expertise, but then you found all of these points of intersection. And so I love how the book really does kind of lean on that to tell a story of like you have this like microcosm of like all of these other things that were going on in New York State, in the country, like big social movements, temperance, suffrage, all of these things and how it connects. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that idea too, like how you decided to structure the book in that way, and maybe what were some of the most interesting or surprising connections that you found between Lilydale as this specific place and how it really connected to these bigger issues and ideas that affect us even to this day. Like in the last chapter, you talk about like cultural appropriation and indigenous communities, and I think people might not necessarily think off the bat like this is what they're going to get, but I that to me was one of the most interesting parts of the book. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the focus, so each chapter is focused on a particular place as like the jumping off point in terms of, by place, I mean a specific site or building or area of Lilydale. And I think that idea, that framework came pretty early in our visits to Lilydale because we sort of walked around the town and saw how important the buildings, the wood, the sort of the physical remnants of things like the Fox Cottage and the stump where people had stood up and given speeches and done readings, how important they were to the ambiance, to the history, to the feeling of Lilydale. And then it was just a matter of, picking out the ones that interested us the most. So, again, once I started seeing those connections with British history and sort of again the sort of British and American spiritualist movement, because they are sharing a lot of the same spiritualist mediums, like the big ones like the Fox sisters spend a lot of time in Britain doing their spiritualist gigs, taking their show on the road. And there's a wide variety of these folks. And the sort of the space then became a way to show how much onion layer you could peel back just by focusing on, okay, well, if we think about the Victorian house, the Victorian home, what does that mean in the bigger picture? And how does that bigger picture then fit in with the history of spiritualism in this place, Lilydale, in Western New York, right? And so Marissa's chapter on temperance just came really naturally because, of course, she and Sarah both knew that this was a dry town because they had visited before. Like Marissa went for a dry bachelor party because one of her friends is in AA and had to have a bachelorette party that was fun but also dry. And so Lilydale, if you're from Buffalo, you know about Lilydale. So you visit Lilydale at some point in your life, most likely. And or you have an aunt who is, like the kooky aunt who is a medium who has lived in or worked in Lilydale at some point. I can't tell you how many people I know who have been like, oh yeah, my aunt was a medium in Lilydale for a while. It's just like, oh, of course they were because you're from Buffalo. And so she had been there for this bachelorette party and had also had sort of has a family history of alcoholism, and then sort of fell down this rabbit hole of thinking about temperance and the movement, and how that is important to the early founding of Lilydale as a radical place founded by radical people. And temperance itself is a radical movement, which is all about like women taking back control over their lives and giving agency to themselves and to control over their families and protecting themselves against domestic violence and poverty, and how then that sort of while it starts out as that super radical movement, the deeper into Lilydale's sort of growth and its attempts to stay relevant and strong, consistent over the 20th century, how temperance then became part of them sort of reining back into a conservative position, right, where they're a male-dominated board by that point, and they're pulling back the reins of physical mediumship to become this sort of, it's still a resort where you can go and do fun things and hear music and speakers and learn, but we're like serious now. We're not gonna be shut down because people don't take us seriously. So I think those are like the really interesting layers that you get when you sort of dig deeply into these kinds of spaces and these kinds of issues. And she chooses for her place, right? The hotels, because there's a hotel in Lilydale, the Maplewood, which is the dry hotel. There is no bar. You cannot get yourself a drink in the dry hotel. But then just outside the gates was the Leyland, and that one sold beer and wine and spirits. So you could walk across the gate, and if you needed a drink real bad, you could get it there. And if today, like, they're not like policing you, so you can bring in your secret box of wine, which we would never have done because we're very good girls. But I'm sure that someone at some point has done that.
Elizabeth, did you have anything to add about that?
No, she hit it because for me, again, like another one of those cross points is, with the feminist movement, right? Like temperance and feminism or the early women's rights movement are really one and the same in the beginning. And so again, it's just so interesting to see how it starts as a radical thing and then it kind of constricts. And, that's the joy of looking at something over the longue durée, like we're really looking at, like Averill said, over almost 150 years. Like it's great.
Yeah. And in the book, you talk a lot about like these other places in New York State that kind of have relationships. So, Buffalo, Rochester, Hydesville. Someone in the Q&A is asking if you came across any mention of Auburn in your research, which also comes up in these kinds of conversations about like suffrage
Yeah.
movements and things like that.
I mean, there were so many people connected to so many different New York towns. I know that somebody was from Auburn. I'm not thinking of anything off the top of my head. I want to say, and I'm so going to blank on the name, but there was a Civil War veteran that had been, he had been held in Andersonville Confederate prison, which was like the worst Confederate prison, and then had gotten out and he had written his diaries, and him and his family had become spiritualists. So his diaries have wound up in Lilydale. I want to say he is connected to Auburn, but again, this is all, it's a big book. You can dig through the footnotes and maybe find that. Sorry.
Go visit yourself and see what Ron can find. I'm sure
Yes, exactly.
if you
Yes.
ask him a specific question
Mhm.
about Auburn, he will know the answer.
You will know the answer. That is
He's
right.
so funny.
It is all in that.
It's all up there. Random people we would sit there in the back table. It's just a big room in this museum/archive. So we sit at the back table and someone would come in and they'd be like, do you know if my grandmother was ever in Lilydale? Her name was Meredith Carroll. And then he'd be like, why would I know who your grandmother is? But actually, why don't I show you? Yes, here she was in this hotel registry.
Awesome.
That's very funny.
Okay.
We have a couple questions kind of surrounding the religious aspect of it. So you touched on this a little bit, but the connection between spiritualism in New York and spiritualism in Britain and how it's interwoven with other Christian movements. And then another question about whether your research connected to mesmerism, magnetic physicians, and how that compared or contrasted to spiritualism.
Yeah, I mean, so mesmerism, animal magnetism, theosophy, right? Like these are all connected to and or precursors to spiritualism, right? So spiritualists in the 1848 are not like inventing a new way of seeing the world out of nothing. They're just sort of coalescing a bunch of ideas into this sort of practice, which, to be fair, also for the first 30 years or more wasn't really a formal religious movement the way we would think about it today, spiritualism as a church and a religious movement, right? It was really nebulous. which is one of the ways and reasons that women were in positions of leadership, right? Because they could be, because they were the faces of the movement in many ways, because they were the mediums. And so again, to Miriam Khan's question about were there Jews involved in the spiritualist movement, in the first 30 years, almost certainly there would have been Jews who were engaging in this mediumship, because it was something that rich people did, right? And there are going to be rich Jews in the 19th century, just like there are rich Quakers in the 19th century and rich Methodists and rich Catholics. And this was what wealthy people did on like Saturday nights. They would go to the post house for a seance with a renowned spirit medium. And that would be the case in the US, in New York, and this would be the case in London, in Edinburgh, right? All the way up through the mid 20th century. So, in many ways, this movement is the same movement across the pond, and it is a shared experience, I think, especially in those first 30 years before it becomes a church, like a formalized church. It is something that people can dabble in regardless of their formal sort of religious affiliation. Absolutely, yeah.
And we're just about at time. So, other than telling people to please go buy the book, read the book, tell your friends, is there anything else that you want to leave people with, or any other little tidbits, anything interesting or surprising from your visits that you'd just like to share with folks before we wrap it up today?
I mean, I will say we've all had varying experiences with mediums and with spiritualism, and none of us came at this book and this project with an intention of proving or disproving spiritualism, right? Like that's not the point of doing history to begin with, and it's not the point of why we did this book. Um, but I think that one of the reasons we shared those experiences in the book, in the writing of the book, and together, right? We shared those experiences literally when we went to Lilydale, and we each booked a spirit medium reading the first day we were there. We went to the live free ones for cold call readings. We went to some of the church services, right? And the talks, was because experiencing Lilydale is much different than just what you can even capture in words on a page. So I think it's worth going if you're a believer, if you're a hardline skeptic, and I remain a skeptic even after having visited there many times and done all the things. So, or maybe even non-believer, skeptic is maybe even too soft a word, but yeah, I think it's worth the opportunity. It's a beautiful place. It's a retreat, really. It's still what it was always intended to be, which is a spiritualist resort and retreat.
Go with an open mind. Everybody experience different things. You'll experience different experiences each time you go, different mediums. So
Yeah.
And if any of you do go to Lilydale because of this book talk, let us know. Send us an email. We hope you do. It's a very beautiful historic place and a very important part of New York State history. And I'm so grateful that you took the time to do the research and organize those files and write about it and share it with us today. So Averill and Elizabeth, thank you so much for being part of our book club. Thank your co-authors for me as well. And thank you all for tuning in. We do have another author talk next week. We're just cramming them in there at the start of the year, talking about this book, The Slip, the New York City street that changed American art forever. I hope you will join us. It'll be very fun. And if you can't make it for that one, go to our YouTube and you can find something that strikes your fancy. So thank you all. Thank you all for tuning in and joining us. And I hope you have a great day.